Hello, everyone, and thank you guys for joining us this evening for week 7 of the RISE Institute in Rugby Research and Injury Prevention 2026 Journal Club. Our first intern that will be presenting today is Hunter, who will be presenting on prevention of sports-related concussion in soccer. Would you please share your screen with us?
Thank you, Brendan. Like Brendan said, my name is Hunter, and I'll be presenting on sports-related concussion in soccer today. Article is Prevention of Sports-Related Concussion in Soccer, a comprehensive review of the literature by Susie Indarti, Andre M.P. Sian, Rosarina, Stephen Tandine, and Marcel Resfondi in the Annals of Medicine and Surgery 2023. So important background to understand is that, as we all know, athletes with concussions are more likely to sustain future ones, and they can also lead to cognitive decline, depression, and degenerative change, with examples including chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, and Alzheimer's. According to Fade et al., 5% of all injuries in the ages 5 to 19 were to the head, which is a significant amount considering the young age of these athletes. The purpose of this study was to compile research on preventing sports-related concussion in soccer and suggest measures for lowering incidence rate in the sport. The method they used was a literature search in which they searched PubMed, EBSCO, DOAJ, and Cochrane for the last 20 years. They included randomized control trials, prospective research, retrospective research, descriptive, and review articles with a focus on soccer. Ended up finding 3 systematic reviews, 7 literature reviews, 5 cross-sectional studies, 1 randomized control trial, 3 prospective studies, and 1 retrospective study. And there will be 8 major topics that I will be covering today, and what their suggestions for the 8 topics are. Okay, starting with the results. They suggested the first thing they suggested was good education of players, coaches, and parents, as it would reduce risk. And this was suggested through presentation by professionals such as doctors and surgeons, or just medical professionals in general, and videos and fact sheets. Regulations were also a big part of their argument and what they recommended, as they place a lot of emphasis on reduction of head-to-head and elbow-to-head injuries with new rules. And however, they did note a limitation in that incidents did not decrease when they limited headers in youth soccer. However, they also did mention that this could have been offset due to the increased amount of reports due to awareness. Um, in a study by Lodgy et al., the FIFA World Cup introduced red cards in 2006, which penalized dangerous contact, such as elbows to the head. Um, and this would lead to a total number of head injuries reducing by around 29%, which is a very large uh, decrease, which is what they cited to kind of support their claims. Another suggestion was cervical strengthening programs. This includes strengthening of the cervical spine area. So, like you can see in the top right, these are some examples that do that, which is strengthening the neck muscles and the stabilizes the area, which help reduce head displacement during high impact collisions, which is thought to um, increase safety during these collisions. And they found that neck strength and size are associated with greater protection against mild traumatic brain injury due to the increased stability, like I said. And they said, and one article found that a 1 pound increase in strength reduced risk of mild TBI by 5% in high schoolers. So the next thing that they really talked about was headgear, and they found that there was very inconclusive results in the literature, because there are some articles found positive results and found reduced head acceleration during high impact, which seems to be positive when looking at concussions. However, other articles found it did not diminish incidence as labeled here, and also are worried that it might promote more reckless play due to an increased sense of safety among players, putting themselves into more risky positions. And then other articles found that it did not reduce impact, but did reduce severity. So there needs to be more research done into the utility of headwear in soccer. Going on to headwear restrictions, they heading restrictions. Um, they found that unintentional or unprepared heading can result in greater injury due to the lack of awareness and thus leading to greater impact collisions. And one way they cited that might be helpful was behavioral skill training, which is a four-step method in which athletes are instructed on how to better improve their technique, and then they are shown an example through modeling. Rehearsal is the step in which they practice, and feedback that is when they're given constructive criticism to improve their technique, and which is hopefully meant to improve their technique when heading and thus reduce the chance of head injury. They also found that greater effective body mass, which is a result from strength, size, and technique, saw less injury, and which is why young players are so susceptible because they are so much lighter and they don't have the same experience um, when heading the ball. They also quickly touched on visual and sensory motor training, which is training the coordination between the eyes and the rest of the body, which increases awareness and enhances anticipation to present collisions, which would reduce the chance of risky head injury. Um, and there's also a great emphasis on youth soccer, in which they had three main pillars which they wanted to stand by. The first was emphasizing rules to control fair play and reduce cheating, which reduces risky plays. They also wanted to teach coordination, reduce falls. And one more thing that they cited was physical maturity differences due to, as we all know, as athletes, typically youth sports are grouped by year of birth, and older children might have greater physical ability, thus leading to dangerous situations. However, that is something that they said was very difficult to control. And finally, looking at detection, which in an article they looked at linear accelerometer sensors, one on the mastoid process right here on the back of the jaw, which senses the linear movement and direction of the head. And this they compared it to video-controlled impact exposures. And while there was discrepancies, further improvement could help with monitoring head impacts, which could lead to quicker treatment for and more treatment for those that need it. And the head count survey is a survey in which players count how many times they headed the ball, and it monitors their exposure. And based on the guidelines, they can create safer restrictions. So there are many limitations with this study. The most important that I found was the integrity to the sport and the differences in belief and science. A lot of players don't want to wear headgear or do neck exercises because they might not believe it, or they also might not just like the look. And thus they might prefer to go bareheaded. And also with integrity to the sport, with adding regulations, adding more red cards, reducing putting regulations on headers, it takes away a really big part of the sport, which could lead to a lot of backlash. Um, in addition, headers are not even the root of all concussions, so all these suggestions about headers would have to be implemented with other suggestions. And headgear, like was cited earlier, might lead to greater recklessness, and due to greater methodologies, no meta-analysis was possible in this literature search. And finally, the conclusion, they found that good education, technique, training, and strengthening was important. Rules modification could be helpful in certain to reduce collisions. Size and strength of players is important during heading, and this is important to consider when looking at youth soccer. Headgear's usefulness is debatable due to the conflicting results. Neck size and strength can help with the stability of the head during collisions, and training might be helpful as well. And vision training can be useful for preventative measure, and contact identification can lead to quicker treatment. As for the application for RRIPG, concussions and head-to-head contact are very common in rugby, and a lot of these suggestions are transferable. Although the sports are very different in how they're played, a lot of these ideas are pretty similar. Inputting rules, looking at headgear, and also teaching technique and doing neck strength training are all suggestions that can be applied to the sport of rugby. Here are my references, and yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Hunter, for an excellent presentation. Does anyone have any questions, or Dr. Lopez, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple things. One, obviously, when you're looking at soccer, it's the challenging or right when the opposing players both jump up together. And that's really what occurs when these potential head-to-head contacts occur. Or now that's one aspect. Obviously, that's why they keep such a close eye on that. Um, where the player's positioned, whether they're inside, closer to the goal versus away from the goal. And then the ball when it comes into that box. That's really the problem with head-to-head contact there. Um, Now the issue is that also with training, as you did Hunter discuss, they should be moving their head with their body, with their core, not necessarily their neck. And this is something where they teach them this when they jump up, they should be moving with their entire core, their body to use their head. That's really something that they should be, employing.
Yeah, that definitely ties into the technique training that the article talked about, and then also the reduction of head-to-head collisions, which is a big part of all the concussions that come from sport.
Our second intern that will be presenting tonight is Jason. Jason will be presenting on the glymphatic system and Meningeal lymphatic systems.
My name is Jason Shite. I'm a rising junior at St. School, and today I'm presenting on an article titled "The Glymphatic and Meningeal Lymphatic Systems May Converge, Connecting Traumatic Brain Injury (TBI) Progression with Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy or CTE Onset" by Barker and colleagues. So just as introduction, we'll start with what we know. So CTE or chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a neurodegenerative disease linked to repeated head impacts. We see it in people such as athletes, in military personnel, and just anyone taking repetitive hits to the head. Clinically, it looks like essentially cognitive decline with things can have nearly identical exposure, but only one develops CTE. And so mechanical force alone does not really explain who gets sick, but rather something else can be modeling the vulnerability. And so the article essentially reframes the question. So instead of asking how hard the brain got hit, it asks how well the brain kind of clears its own waste afterwards. And just for two abbreviations we're used throughout, so CSF is going to be cerebrospinal fluid, and ISF is going to be interstitial fluid, and these three are fluids present and relevant for our talk. As for some background, we note that the body clears waste through the lymphatic system, but the brain doesn't really have a classical lymphatics, and it uses two coupled systems instead. So the first one, the glymphatic system, it's going to be a network that runs along blood vessels that exchanges CSF with ISF, and so that exchange essentially what washes waste out of the tissue. And so what it clears is the p-tau, the amyloid beta, TDP-43, and inflammatory cytokines, all which we care about. And the second is going to be the meningeal lymphatic system. And so these are going to be the actual lymphatic vessels sitting in the dura or the tough outer membrane around the brain. They're going to drain CSF to the deep cervical lymph nodes in your neck. And it's also where the brain is kind of like immune, like surveillance happens. And both get disrupted by traumatic brain injury or TBI, and both have been implicated in why CTE shows up years later. And so let's talk about how they connect. I'm just going to go into detail with the first one is the glymphatic system. So you can see on the right, it's a very basic circuit of how the kind of system works. And so the idea is your arteries pulse with every heartbeat, and that sort of pulsation, it pushes CSF inward along the outside of the blood vessels. And so to get into the brain tissue, the fluid has to cross the barrier, and it does through AQP4 water channels or aquaporin 4. And so essentially these sit on the end feet of astrocytes, you can see in the diagram, which are support cells that wrap around the blood vessels. And so fluid moves along through these channels and mixes with ISF, picks up waste, and then exits along the veins. And so I like two things that kind of makes it so interesting is first that it's sleep dependent. And so during slow wave sleep, noradrenaline is gonna drop and the space between your brains is gonna expand. And so this just means more space means more clearance. And so the brain most effectively clears waste when you're unconscious or when you're in good sleep. And the second is that the process it's not finished at birth, and so it's going to mature along your early years alongside your blood vessels and your sleep-wake cycles. And so this means that trauma early in life, like traumatic insults, they may permanently reduce, like cap, how much clearance capacity you can develop over time, which is like one of the candidates to why two athletes with the same hits might get different outcomes regarding CTE. And so the next system is a meningeal lymphatic system, and so it's kind of the drainage side. So the vessels, LMVs and MLVs, which are meningeal lymphatic vessels, they sit in the dura and they run along the venous sinuses and cranial nerves, as you can see in the figure. They're going to carry CSF and ISF down to the deep cervical lymph nodes. And so these are kind of strange compared to lymphatics like anywhere else in your body because they form postnatally after birth rather than in embryo. And they mostly lack the internal valves that normally would keep lymph flowing in one direction. And so flow would then depend on the pressure gradients and on being close to actual veins. And so this makes them actually kind of fragile. And so the growth signal is called VEGFC, which acts through what's called a VEGF-R3 receptor. And so if it's blocked, the vessel's going to regress and the drainage is going to drop. But if it's properly delivered, then the vessel's going to grow and clearance improve, just vice versa. And because they stay like malleable into adulthood, you can like act on them. You can act on them in a living patient. And so the kind of main argument paper is based on the ISF-CS interface. And so the claim is that these two systems, the glymphatic and the meningeal lymphatic, they aren't really too distinct, but rather connected along one axis. And so the idea is CSF comes in, it exchanges with ISF and leaves through the meningeal lymphatics to the lymph nodes. If you break any one link, the whole thing's going to fail. And so kind of two pieces of support. So first is that their development is co-timed, so each depends on the other maturing. And so p-tau and amyloid beta accumulate specifically along the venous exit routes. And so that means pathology isn't scattered randomly, it's piling up in the drainage channels. And also there's just newer anatomy supports it. So arachnoid granulations, which I'll show you later on, um, they were taught up as passive valves, dumping CSF into venous blood. But now we can note that they're actually full of immune cells, and CSF appears to pass through the lymphatic compartments first. That's something to note. And so what happens like the moment you get hit? So kind of four things at once. The first thing is aquaporin 4, it depolarizes, meaning the channels lose their organized positions on the astron head feet. And so essentially the exchange stops. And also glymphatic flows in the stall. And next is the intracranial pressure in your head is going to rise, and as a result, there's going to be swelling, which compresses the meningeal lymphatics, which do not have smooth muscle to kind of resist. And the next is that neural oscillations are going to slow and fall out of sync, and these rhythms are kind of what help drive fluid movements that's going to messed up too. And then lastly, sleep. So about 8% of TBI patients develop new sleep disorders, and the system kind of depends on sleep. And the system that depends on sleep is going to lose sleep as well. And so it's going to kind of end up in a cycle. And so with CTE, the idea is that acute damage it can become permanent over time. So the idea is that astroglial scarring is going to set in and aquaporin 4 is going to stay depolarized, which results in the meningeal vessels degenerating structurally as inflammation continues. And then I guess like going back to the loop, so the idea is p-tau is going to deposit in the locus ceruleus, which is kind of the brain's noradrenergic center as in the control and it kind of controls the sleep-wake cycle. And so it gets damaged, and so sleep degrades. But then degraded sleep means less lymphatic clearance, and less clearance means more p-tau, and so on and so forth. It's going to continue damaging the locus ceruleus. And so the disease is kind of self-degenerating, and so it's one of the explanations for why CT keeps advancing years after an athlete active in the sport has like stopped and retired. And so a main thing about this paper is that it's not actually tested on humans, it's tested on rodents, and so I'm just going to explain limitations regarding that. And so the first thing is that the meningeal lymphatics for rats are postnatal while they present prenatally in humans. And another thing is that their vessels are dorsal dominant, meaning they run over the top of the skulls, where ours appear to be basal dominant, so they're going to be concentrating like kind of skull base with cranial nerves exit. So that means like blocking the dorsal vessels in a mouse is going to hit the main exit while doing the same in a human might only hit like a side route or not do much damage. Another thing is I explained before, you can see here in the diagram. So we have prominent arachnoid granulations as shown in the figure, and rodents essentially don't. And then lastly, the force driving the whole system, the kind of pulse is really different by a factor of about 8. So a mouse's heart rate is about 500 BPM, while ours is around 60 to 70 BPM. And so we conclude that preclinical findings need validation in actual human models before we trust the conclusion from this article. And so kind of where this leads is the conclusion and the applications. So we note that if clearance is really the problem, then restoring clearance will be the treatment. And so the idea is we can use VGFC to regrow the meningeal lymphatics, as well as 40 Hz gamma stimulation, which is really just like a flickering light, to kind of retrain the oscillations and improve aquaporin 4 function. And as well as using sleep optimization plus IL-33, which is a cytokine that enhances drainage in order to improve like the functionality of the system. Another thing regarding this diagnosis, so CTE right now can only be confirmed based on autopsy or after someone dies, which means nobody can get diagnosed while treatment could still help. And we're like, no clinical trial can really enroll patients based on disease trying to treat. And then there are methods like 3D FLAIR and DC MRI, which can kind of image clear failure in person. And so if you measure the failure, then you have biomarker and a trial endpoint. But for our conclusion, we know that disruptive lymphatic and meningeal lymphatic clearance is actually a plausible mechanism which links repetitive head trauma to CTE. But still, we need further evidence with humans in order to fully make a conclusion. Here are my references. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jason, for an informing presentation. Does anyone have any question? Jack?
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation, Jason. I was wondering, did the article mention anything about like rodents and how much sleep they need and if that affects their lymphatic system and if it works differently? Because I looked it up just now and it said like they take like a lot of rodents tend to take like periodic naps like throughout the day instead of like one long period of sleep. So did the article mention anything about that?
Yeah, a little bit. It did mention like it's a lot of stuff about periodic sleeps. I guess like it's more like tailored towards humans though. Like humans actually need like the sleep which kind of functions for the drainage systems. Like in general, like it's kind of more linked where like humans need that kind of like sleep and with like maybe less optimized sleep, it's gonna be harder for them to like avoid like the blocks and drainage that really leads to CTE.
Austin?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Jason. I was wondering if your paper mentioned anything about future steps towards either biomarkers to detect CTE in live humans or potential imaging or anything else like applications that might help to diagnose that for in the future.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like it did mention the stuff like 3D FLAIR and DCMRI. I didn't look into too much detail about the methods, but I'm pretty sure those could be kind of used to like aid imaging a bit. It's still like CT is still a thing which can only be confirmed in the autopsy, so it's still like something that's being looked into.
Dr. Lopez, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you so much. Why don't we move out of presentation mode to, more importantly, I think we hit on there, particularly about the sleep aspect and its importance in actually the clearing out or the cleaning system. Did they discuss the benefits of optimal like REM? And obviously, did they consider inducing sleep?
I don't know much about the latter, but they did talk about like sleep optimization as being important regarding the REM too, yeah.
As what?
Regarding like the REM part where like sleep cycle is important with optimization.
Right. So basically, does everyone understand? So the deeper you sleep, particularly, this lymphatic system is functions its best at that point. It's like on autopilot itself at that juncture that it's clearing out your system and ideally removing any particles that can reside in the gyri or at the bottoms. The point is, but if you have problem sleeping or you are recovering from a traumatic brain injury, this is why it benefits at that point you to move into the direction of developing CTE or moving into a direction of developing residual problems from or post traumatic brain injury, because it just gets worse. I just want to make sure, does everyone understand what I just said and the importance of that, right? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jason. Difficult topic, but thank you for presenting.
Our third intern that will be presenting today is Siddhant, who will be presenting on feasibility of data collection via consumer. Siddhant, when you're ready, could you share your screen with us?
Thank you for the introduction. Today, I'll be presenting on feasibility of data collection via consumer-grade wearable devices and adolescent student athletes prospective longitudinal cohort study. This was published by Daniel Ransom at JMIR Formative Research in 2025. Concussions and orthopedic injuries require regular monitoring, but athletes are typically only seen in the clinic every 1 to 2 weeks. That leaves gaps in understanding what happens during recovery. Wearable devices can continuously collect heart rate, activity, and sleep data in an athlete's normal environment, but it's still not clear whether adolescent athletes will consistently wear these devices long enough for the data to be useful. The purpose of the study was to determine whether consumer-grade wearable devices are a feasible option for monitoring recovery. This was a prospective longitudinal cohort study involving 34 high school athletes between the ages of 14 and 18. Half of them had concussions and half of them had orthopedic injuries. Each participant received a Fitbit Sense and was instructed to wear it throughout the day and while sleeping until medical clearance plus an additional 4 to 6 weeks. The Fitbit continuously recorded heart rate, physical activity, and sleep data throughout the study. The primary outcome was feasibility, which was measured using participant adherence. Researchers looked at whether participants consistently wore the Fitbit by tracking hourly and daily heart rate recordings. It's important to remember that this study wasn't evaluating recovery outcomes. It asked whether researchers could reliably collect long-term physiological data using a consumer wearable. Overall, adherence was very high. The orthopedic injury group had a median adherence of about 95%, while the concussion group had 93%. Most athletes contributed data for about 2 months, and only one participant required a replacement device. Adherence was also similar during both the day and overnight, showing that participants were willing to wear the Fitbit 24 hours a day consistently. The authors concluded that wearable devices are a practical way to collect continuous physiological data during injury recovery. This approach could eventually allow clinicians to monitor recovery between clinic visits and better understand recovery patterns in real-world settings. However, authors also point out that consumer-grade devices are not as accurate as medical-grade equipment, and that some sports require athletes to remove the watch during practices or games. One major strength was the excellent participant adherence, showing that adolescent athletes were willing to use the devices consistently. The study also collected continuous real-world data with very few technical issues. However, the sample size was very small. The participant population lacked diversity, and the study only evaluated feasibility. It did not show that the wearable devices improve recovery at all. The study provides an important first step toward integrating wearable technology into sports medicine research. The high adherence suggests that continuous monitoring is practical in adolescent athletes, but larger studies are needed to determine whether these data can actually improve clinical decision making. Overall, this paper demonstrates that consumer-grade wearable devices are feasible for monitoring recovery, but more research is needed before they become part of the routine of clinical care. Thank you. These are my references.
Thank you, Sadat, for an excellent presentation. You could close your screen share. Does anyone have any questions for Sadat? Jack.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I was just wondering, did the authors say like how long after the injuries these studies were taken for like the athletes?
Not specifically, but they did say it was until the end of clinical clinical trials and 4 to 6 weeks after that.
Thank you.
Austin?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting study. I would be very curious to see what kind of measurables they might use in the future, and also what other devices they might use in the future, whether it's an Apple Watch or what other Google devices are out there, and the metrics that future studies might observe in this recovery from concussion. Did this paper touch on that at all, or was it simply just feasibility, it might work, yes or no?
It was mainly about feasibility. It mainly measured heart rate, physical activity, and sleep. But I don't know the exact units of measurement they used.
Okay. Yeah, there is a lot of things that can be measured on the back end with obviously, like you mentioned, medical grade devices, but also some of the metrics from Apple devices. So I think that'd be another step forward to measure.
Dr. Lopez, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for bringing up this topic. I think what's interesting is obviously we can all envision some of the sports that we've been talking about. You probably wouldn't be wearing, a smart watch or even a Fitbit because it's challenging to maybe even, wear that if you're tackling or if you're maybe, you know, it would be just challenging, even if you're in more of let's say, a sport that's more physically aggressive now than it used to be. Basketball per se now it's a little bit more physical. So having anything on your wrist, I don't know how um, favorable it would be for active play. So I guess the question is, and I'll ask you briefly, but I know you may not have the answer to it, Sidon. It's maybe just a topic that I'm bringing up for us to generally discuss. That is, what kind of ideas did they say could be improved with this study, or what did they suggest about the wearable technology and what they would have to do or move towards? Would they have to move, away from rings, away from wrist worn, maybe using the GPS individual items in the jerseys, but then you have to buy the jerseys for that. Obviously, I'm just wondering what they discussed on that.
You did mention that wrist like wearables or any wearables might come in the way of certain sports. So the paper did mention that that was a limitation and that the small portion of athletes that did not adhere, a few mentioned that it did obstruct their performance. And the main limitation of this paper was small sample size and limited diversity. This paper mainly focused on Caucasian teenagers. Caucasian, I forget, male or female teenager. It was single gender teenagers. And the small sample size, obviously, there was only 34 participants. Um, Ideally, there should be a lot more. And what was the rest of your question? Did that answer?
Yeah, you answered the question. The main gist of it was whether or not athletes would be, favorable of actually wearing the wearable technology. Now, what happens is that obviously the big concern is their adherence, right? Now, did they discuss about um, stagnant or sedentary times, and how did they address that? Right? Maybe they took them off, right? I know I definitely dislike the rubber band things that everyone wears because they're just full of sweat and everything underneath the wrists. I don't know. You tell me, did they discuss anything about that? Did they address that or try to discuss that?
Um, like I said, they did discuss about it inhibiting performance, but they didn't really discuss any further than that. They didn't go any deeper.
Yeah, and probably it didn't inhibit performance. It's probably just because you're not used to it. All right. So any athlete who is trained probably never wore a Fitbit or wore a smartwatch while they're playing sports. They probably, strip themselves down and they, practice or they play. So it may be very much an
Also,
adjustable or getting used to. Go ahead, please. Anyway, that thank you so much.
also, like I said, the main demographic was teenagers and gender teenagers, which is limited, and um, they weren't able to do these on collegiate athletes and like Olympic level athletes, which um have not sensitivity, but would not um like something on their wrist or would not adhere to something in like getting in the way of their performance.
I think that's what it is. It's more of a favoritism. And like I said, when I was discussing the sedentary or the stagnant time frames, it's probably, they probably even took it off, or maybe they, forgot to put it back on. And that's why I was wondering what they did with that loss of data or time. Interesting. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Sadat, for an excellent presentation. And that will conclude week 7 of the RISE Institute in Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Journal Club. Thank you all for attending.